Hello, thank you for joining the Heritage Alliance for this special presentation of our History Happy Hour, all about Jonesborough's 19th century buildings, handmade beauties with Dr. Bill Kennedy. We are doing this recording because so many people came out to see this presentation and voiced an interest in this presentation. So Dr. Kennedy was kind enough to do the presentation again for us, and we're excited you're watching it today, so we're going to turn it over to him.
Thank you, Anne. This is about Jonesborough's 19th century buildings that I call handmade beauties. When I first discovered Jonesborough in 1971, it was love at first sight. We then moved here in 1973, and I became a building watcher. I kept discovering more while looking at the same buildings. I realized that they had stories to tell if I paid attention. Jonesborough is a museum of East Tennessee architecture, said Dr. Richard Hale, who is a Massachusetts archivist and a National Trust director. He was a consultant in 1969 through the Tennessee Historical Commission. He said also that it's a place where great people have done great things, and it's a place where social history can still be seen. And that's what I've discovered. These brick buildings built during the 19th century were literally from the ground up. The bricks and mortar had to be dug out of the ground, and that was highly labor intensive. We've got plenty of water and plenty of wet clay in our area, but the clay had to be dug out by hand. There were many impurities ranging from microscopic to pebble sizes in the clay. Our clay contains between 5 and 6% of red iron oxides, giving it its color range from pink to dark red. Other colors from the mineral impurities include calcium, giving it a yellow color, magnesia and alumina, giving it a buff color, and manganese, giving it a brown color. Colors are also influenced by the fuels that were used and the amount of heat that a brick was exposed to during the firing process. Well, there were 6 steps in the 19th century in making bricks. Weathering by spreading the clay in thin layers and letting it dry for several months. Crushing the clay and then mixing it with 30% sand and adding water. Then molding, loading the clay at the consistency of soft mud into sand-lined molds, and letting that mix dry in molds long enough to be handled, then removing the bricks from the molds and letting the bricks dry longer by spreading and turning them. A very time-consuming, labor-intensive process. Then the bricks had to be stacked into kilns loaded with fuel, such as hardwoods, later coal, and still later gas. Heating the kilns as high as 1800 degrees Fahrenheit to fire or burn or bake the bricks. All 3 terms were used. We would commonly use the word fire today. Heat had to be maintained for several days. Then the kiln had to be cooled for several days, and then the bricks were taken out and sorted. So this was really a long process. The bricks had to be stacked into the kilns in carefully designed ways, leaving spaces among the bricks for exposure to the heat. The bricks would shrink about 8% while drying and another 6% while in the kilns. So the bricks had to be placed in molds that were intentionally a little large in order to compensate for that shrinking. And they also had to be compressed by hand into the molds. And that compression by hand was not as high as it would be later using machine for pressure. Therefore, there were relatively low density of these bricks, making them vulnerable for absorbing too much moisture after the building was constructed. And the tradition has it that kilns around here were built on the job sites, and the clay was dug from what later became the basements. But we know of a few brickyards that are mentioned in the historical documents. John Lyle had one in 1854. James Dosser, businessman, had one in 1878. Mathis and February, who were partners, had one in 1880, and R.M. May with Edmund Bayliss as his foreman in 1887. And in 1886, we have the interesting note that Dr. J.A. Pierce made his own bricks, presumably for his own house, but vandals had burned about 1,000 of them. These are sketches of brick molds that were used during the middle part of the 19th century. And these are sketches of various kilns. Now, the kilns in number 1 and 3 were used probably in brickyards. The type of kiln that was built on the job site is most likely number 2. The bricks had to be of a specific shape. The length of a brick needed to equal twice the width plus 1 mortar joint. And the length also had to equal 3 times the thickness of the bricks plus 2 joints. There were 3 different classifications of bricks in the middle part of the 19th century. There was the stock brick, which were more uniform and attractive, harder fired, and better able to resist weathering. Later, those were called facing bricks because they generally were selected to use on the outer faces of walls where they would be seen. Common bricks, much more common, of course, than stock bricks, were used for those parts of the walls that were being covered. Special molded bricks were molded for non-standard shapes for specific purposes, usually ornamental purposes, and we'll be seeing some of those examples here in just a few minutes. Then the lime mortar had to be taken from the ground also. Lime is taken from limestone in our area. Pure limestone is calcium carbonate. Mud, sand, and clay are common impurities in the limestone. Quicklime was produced, and that's calcium oxide, by breaking the limestone into fist-sized pieces, a labor-intensive process in itself, and then loading it into kilns in layers about 2 feet thick over layered wood and burning it for 3 days. It could be used directly to make mortar, but it soon became inert if exposed to air or moisture for too long a period of time. And then so slaking lime was done to give it a longer storage life by adding water to quicklime to convert it from calcium oxide to calcium hydrate. There were 4 ways of slaking lime: sprinkling it with water, which would have been time consuming and required a lot of attention, or immersing the quicklime underwater and exposure of the air for a considerable length of time. You could kind of forget about it, but who knows how long that would take. And then making lime paste. This would have been the more popular way of doing it because it speeded up the process. To do that, you put the quicklime into a pit or a vat, and you added more water than required, and then you allowed it to stand and slake. Lime paste can be covered and stored for months or even years. Common lime mortar is a mixture of lime, sand, and water. There were 3 different basic types. There was the dry pulverized quicklime and sand mix with water added and mixed. And then you could take dry sand added to the lime paste and thoroughly mixed with water added if necessary. And then this is probably more the type of mixing of mortar that we would think of today. The slaked lime could be converted into powder after appropriate drying, and then sand and water mixed, either simultaneously or by adding the water to previously mixed slaked lime powder and sand. So any of these alternatives, of course, were highly labor intensive and time consuming. Well, there are 2 bonding patterns that are common here in Jonesborough. There's the common American bond in the mid-19th century buildings and the Flemish Bond. Now, this on your left is an example of the common American bond. It is made up of primarily of rows of stretchers, as you see labeled there, alternating usually 6 or 7 rows of stretchers to put in 1 row of headers. Now, how did this end up looking when you actually looked at the wall? Well, come with me on our front porch, where my wife Virginia and I live at 400 West Main Street, and let's take a look at the common American bond. And you can see from the labeling there that there are more rows of stretchers where we're seeing the sides of the bricks than there are of headers where we're seeing the ends of the bricks. And if we look at how this wall is put together in cross section, and this is a wonderful drawing by William Stout, we can see, as I have colored the headers in red, that the wall, typical for this mid-19th century construction that we're talking about, was made up of 3 layers of bricks, 3 brick layers thick. And you had a header protruding to the face of the wall, which would be to your left in this drawing, and a header alternating among stretchers pointing to the inside of the wall to your right, as seen in this drawing. And so by alternating the position of the headers to tie together the outer face of the brick on the exterior of the wall and the inner face of the brick on the interior of the wall or the house, you had a good system for tying the layers of the wall together and giving them stability. And that drawing, I think, shows that very well. That cross section was a part of the documentation by William Stout of the Rufus Wells house that had a common American bond. Rufus Wells was here in Jonesborough in the 1850s and early 60s. He had to leave, as I recall, in about 1863 because of the war. And he was pastor of Jonesborough Presbyterian Church. His house was built in 1855. And we were able to document the house because we disassembled it and moved it into the historic district. It had been built on the edge of the historic district, and we were not able to save it in its original site. In that particular house, there were 5 widths of brick thickness at the foundation level, and the foundation level extended 75 inches below the bottoms of the floor joists. The way they built these houses is they simply dug down to undisturbed clay and started laying the bricks. That means that there was no moisture barrier of any kind, as we're accustomed to in modern construction. And when I say modern construction, I mean really late 19th century and all through the 20th century, when the technology really changed, and we're still using some of those modern techniques today. Then there were 4 brick widths thick in the walls of the first floor and 3 brick widths thick in the walls of the second floor. That was an unusually well-built house. More thickness of the walls than we see in many of the houses here in town. And here was that house as it was situated over on 11E, just outside the historic zone or historic district. And here we are salvaging those bricks, preparing that house to be relocated elsewhere in the historic district, here on the southeast corner of College Street and Washington Drive inside our historic district. It was a wonderful project that the Heritage Alliance took on fairly early in its years as the Heritage Alliance. Then we come to the Flemish Bond. This was a more dressy bond than the common American bond. In this particular type of bonding, we had, if you look horizontally in a row of bricks, we had stretchers alternating with headers. And then if you looked vertically, and I have again colored the headers in red, if you look vertically, you have the same pattern: stretcher, header, stretcher, header, stretcher, header, going down the wall. And the way this was done was to lay the bricks in patterns of square units of 4.5 bricks each, as I've shown in that drawing, as I've colored yellow, and I have continued to color the headers in red to show how that wall was put together, and gave it a great deal of strength, probably more strength than the common American bond, but also more highly labor intensive. Many of our houses that were built before the Civil War show that Flemish bond on the face of the house, or if it's a corner house, on the street side of the house. And here it is shown in the Baptist church. All 3 of our Greek Revival churches, the Baptist Church, the Jonesborough Methodist Church, United Methodist Church, and the Jonesborough Presbyterian Church, all 3 of those churches were built with the Flemish bond, and that's an easy place to see them by looking at those churches. Well, there was one exception to the usual bonding pattern of the common American bond or the Flemish bond, and this was a mystery in this wonderful house that's back on College Street, 306 College. Look at that wall, and where are the headers? This is a mystery. where are the headers that tie the layers of the wall together? We know this is a thick, solid masonry wall. Well, I have a theory about that, and that is that perhaps the wall was tied together with special square molded bricks, such as this one you see in this picture, that was made perfect for the length of the brick, and also was made such that if it replaced a header or replaced several headers in a row, 2 headers to be exact, then it would tie the outer layers together. And if one of these were placed on the inside of the wall, it would tie the 2 inner layers together. So this is my theory, and you can see several of these in the driveway at 210 West Main Street, this house right here. So when you're on a walk, you might look for that. Well, to look further and more closely at bricks, come with me again to our front porch at 400 West Main Street. But before we do that, let's look around on the west side of the house and see that there were actually 2 kiln loads that were required to build this house. If we look closely, we can see this in other buildings in town too, but here it's really conspicuous. And I believe that this represents that these bricks were probably made in a brickyard. This house was built in 1869. But if we go back to the porch and we look closely at the bricks, we see a lot of personality in these individual bricks. We see a lot of variation of color. We see splits that were originally in the clay that were fired into the clay. We see little impurities such as little pieces of coal or perhaps little sticks, bits of sticks or limbs that were left in the bricks. And then we also see a very interesting thing, that the mortar joints are painted white, but if you look at the mortar joints behind that white painting, which we call penciling, you see that the original mortar joints are brown or brownish or buff colored. And you also see that the joints were quite wide. So how did they get around wide joints? Because keep in mind, these are hand molded bricks. And in fact, there to the left, you see some fingerprints in that brick. They painted the mortar joints to make them look slicker than they really were. They were refining the work that was the best they could do with the technology that they had in hand molded bricks, but they were trying to dress it up and make it look better. And here you have an example of wonderful red bricks from the iron oxide that I mentioned a while ago, but then you have dark glazed looking colors coming up on that brick in the bottom of the picture. And in some research that they did in Colonial Williamsburg some years ago, they found that that color comes out of the tannin in oak when oak was used for firing the kilns. So you see all kinds of details like that that are just wonderful in the bricks. Here, rather than seeing a few larger impurities, you see scattered through the brick a lot of impurities. And whoops, what is that in the mortar joints? Some messages and a name. Well, down at the bottom, Ellis Sabin. And this was a picture that we made, and we documented many, many mortar joints in the Rufus Wells house before it was disassembled and moved over on College and Washington Drive. And then the message up at the top says, if I can read it very well, let's see. Oh, it's in the middle mortar joint. Our happiest days end or are fast. Our happiest days are fast. I hope you're trying to read it with me. Are fast disappearing. Are fast passing away. Our happiest days are fast passing away. It's fun to look for messages like that in mortar joints, usually beneath the protection of porches, because of course, porches were where people gathered socially, and porches were where they could sign the mortar joints and leave messages for each other. But in addition to the penciling of mortar joints that I just demonstrated for you and just showed you, early painting with lime-based iron oxides was also common. This Jonesborough's only Octagon House was painted completely red with iron oxide paints, lime-based paints. And you see it very well preserved on this side porch. where after having painted it red, then they penciled in the mortar joints. So look for this type of thing because it's visible in several different houses in Jonesborough, something for you to look for as you look at some of the mid-19th century houses. Now, there are fundamental principles that were observed very carefully here in Jonesborough in building these mid-19th century houses. First of all, they were made, as I've just mentioned, of handmade low-fired bricks, and the bricks have outer shells or crusts that protect softer interiors. I compare it with a boiled egg. The boiled egg remains intact as long as the shell is intact. But of course, we intentionally break the shells of a boiled egg so we can eat the egg. That destroys the interior of the egg. The bricks are not intended to be destroyed, so we hope that the outer shell or crust remains intact because we know that the inner part of the brick is soft. And if we break that outer shell, then that subjects the brick to too much moisture and weathering and shortens the life of the brick. Well, the bricks are the structural units. Their strength depends on a strong, intact outer crust. Any penetration or breakage of the stronger outer crusts weakens the bricks and exposes them to deterioration. Mortar is the bedding material for the bricks, very much unlike our modern day mortars, where the mortar becomes a part of the strength of the building. The buildings have elasticity that permits microscopic movements, primarily through the mortar. Microscopic movements through bricks can break the outer crusts. Therefore, the mortar must be softer and more elastic than the bricks so that the micro movement can occur in the bedding material and not through the bricks. All repairs, therefore, have got to match the original materials in strength and elasticity. Repairs using modern rigid materials is very damaging to 19th century masonry. And the 19th century masonry has a high susceptibility to water damage, not only water from above, such as a leaking roof or a deteriorating windowsill, but also rising damp. That is ordinary rain and freeze thaw. And the rising damp is simply a matter of dampness that comes up from the ground and wicks its way into these walls that don't have any moisture barrier and that are like sponges in soaking up the water. Here in this house at 200 West Main Street, we have a good example of rising damp that has done a lot of damage to this house, such that some of these bricks that you see adjacent to this window are actually don't have any mortar in them at all, and they're shifting, they're collapsing. The house is not in any kind of danger of failure at this point, but those parts of the wall really need repairs. And what you see in the whiteness on the surface of the bricks is where the lime has been dissolved out of the bricks by the dampness water coming up from the ground. And then as it evaporates, the water carries the lime to the surface of the brick and mortar and leaves this unsightly white deposit. And by the way, this is one of the houses that was painted red and then penciled. Here we have back to the Rufus Wells house as it was reassembled on the corner of College Street and Washington. They used the same early bricks in building these retaining walls for the driveway. And unfortunately, they were not completely aware of the importance of selecting really hard bricks in building this wall. And we can see spalling, that is losing the face of some of the bricks in this wall. That's a good example of what happens to a brick whose outer crust has been broken, exposing the soft interior to weathering. Now, one of the most exciting things I think about these houses is the art of design that we see in the houses. In the earlier period, in the federal period, such as this house on Woodrow Street and this house on College Street, the Greek Revival period, we have front symmetry and balance. And if we look at how these designs were made, we can superimpose some geometric figures to the front of this building, which is 1910, and this is the only 20th century building I'm showing, simply because this Ash Street Courthouse building is so much in the news here locally right now for its being restored. And also these geometric figures have been superimposed on this front elevation, front design of the building. And so what you see here is a square and a circle, and then outlining the entire building, a rectangle with 2 ellipses, and then diagonals placed inside that in the red. And that's how they worked out these beautiful symmetrical designs mathematically in the Federal period and in the Greek Revival period in our area. And of course, going on much earlier than that in areas on the coast and in areas in Europe, really going back to the ancient Roman and ancient Greek civilizations. That's where this has been borrowed from. And here, if you take that same basic geometric design made up of the square, the circle, the rectangle, and 2 ellipses, and you apply grids to it, you get another aspect of the beautiful design. Now, when we get into the Victorian period, such as this building built and this home built in the mid 1870s, you see a lot of freedom. Rather than having one solid wall at one level, such as in the earlier periods, you've got one wall pulled forward of the center wall where the stair wall is and the tower is, and another wall pushed backwards. But when you look at those individual walls and those individual parts of the structure, you still see that early math being applied. Beautiful. Now, we've got some specialized structures in town that are just really beautiful in their ornament, that are made of stock bricks and common bricks. Now, remember that the stock bricks are the ones that are really chosen as the first-class bricks and are used in the faces. But they were also used to make up wonderful ornaments. This tower is one good example. It doesn't have any special molded bricks. We'll get to those in a few minutes. This is all stock bricks. This is all of bricks that are of the standard shape that I showed you earlier, including the arches there in the windows. And then if we look at the same house at this round window in the gable, we see the same type of use of the stock bricks, except in the upper part of the circle enclosing the circle. And I don't know whether that was a brick that was actually cut or whether it was a brick that was molded. Regardless of which it was, it certainly has stood the test of time for nearly 150 years. And then if we look back at the Octagon House, which I look at as a wedding cake house because of its shape, we see chimneys. Chimneys around town are built with corbelling, which is the stepping out and then the stepping in of layers of stretchers of the bricks, and then a band below the corbelling. Makes a beautiful chimney. And the reason that there are 2 chimneys here, at least this is my theory, is that they probably built the second chimney very carefully, reproducing the design of the first chimney when they were installing a coal burning furnace. And then we see chimneys again here with dentils and with panels. The panels in this case are stuccoed in or covered with mortar in the Malk building downtown across the side street from the courthouse. And then one of the characteristics of ornamentation in houses particularly before the Civil War was the stepped gable. And these houses are on the north side of East Main Street in the 100 block. The one in the foreground is across Boone Street from the First Baptist Church. And the chimneys are incorporated into the stepped gables. We think that the stepped gables came to us through the Shenandoah Valley from settlers from Flanders, and so therefore came along with the Flemish Bond, most likely. And more or less across the corner from those buildings is this wonderful house directly in front of the Baptist Church, also with stepped gables and with chimneys. Here's a good close-up of that. This was being done before the Civil War, but not much after the Civil War, although I'll show you one example that was after the Civil War. Then we have this wonderful house on 100 East Woodrow. Doesn't look like there's much ornamentation on that house until you get around to the back and you look at the cornice. And here you have stepping out 5 different corbels leading up to the roof line, a beautiful way of treating the cornice of the house. And this is unique to this house in town. And then if we get back to the house at 200 West Main Street, we see beautiful dentals, 3 layers of dentals. Look carefully under the gutter and you can see a 3rd layer going up, where this wonderful corbelling type cornice has incorporated dentals in 3 separate layers with layers of stretchers between each of the layers of the dentals, and made a beautiful cornice out of simple bricks that are standard in their shape. Then we see a similar thing in some of our business buildings in town, even to the point of building arches without using any special molded bricks. All of these are standard shaped bricks, but wonderful ornamentation in those bricks. And then we have wonderful ornamentation with special molded bricks that are combined with stock bricks. So let's take a look at some of those. Here's Lamson Hall, directly across the street from the courthouse. Wonderful extended dentals and bands at the top and arched windows. And if we look up further on this building, we see at the top, the 3rd course down, what is fondly called rat's teeth or mouse teeth. Those are special molded bricks to show those points. And we have a row of those that enhance further the ornamentation. But notice the ornamentation of the arches above the window, the arches above the band at the attic level, and those pendants that are made of brick on the front of the building. Beautiful, beautiful work. And here we see the pointed special molded bricks again, the rat teeth again, in 2 courses on this wonderful building. And we see a recessed panel there. The panel, of course, is done with standard laying of the stock bricks. And then we also, if we look at some of the cornices, such as in this house on East Main Street, we see that the cornices often were made up of molded bricks, special molded bricks. And here we have, at the level of the gutter, a brick molded with a cove in it. And below that, we have a brick forming a sort of a bead. And as those are joined together, we have a modified S curve or an OG curve for that particular cornice. And the OG curve is still used today in modern extruded gutter systems and in construction of houses. It's a classic element in building that comes from the ancient Greeks and has never gone out of style. And then below that, of course, we have a row of headers, and we also have a row of stretchers, and then below that we have the row of headers. And then if we look back at this house on College Street that we've been looking at from several different points of view, we look at this bay window. The bay window was designed so that light could come into the room, and keep in mind this is far ahead of any electric light bulbs. Light could come into the room from early morning to late afternoon, the way these windows were arranged in this bay window. And then we look at these bricks closely, and they were special molded bricks. And there they are alternating with 45-degree angles molded into the ends of these bricks, or molded close to the ends of these bricks. About 1/4 of the brick roughly has this 45-degree molded angle built into it, a special molded brick for ornamentation. And then we look at the same house on the east side. There's a rectangular rather than an octagonal bay window. And we look closely at this bay window and we see a water table that is also done the same way with special molded bricks. Beautiful special molded bricks forming the water table, making a transition on the exterior from a wider foundational level wall to a first floor level wall, but also in such a way as to shed water off of that foundation wall, and then wonderful panel making with the standard stock bricks and courses above, bringing together a beautiful design that we still enjoy today. And then in this house, we can see even more the use of standard face bricks or stock bricks in making this very special window hood, I would call it, or a window lintel. And it has in it some triangular cross-shaped bricks that probably are molded bricks in triangular shape, 3 of them. But the other bricks are standard stock bricks. And by the way, I look at that as being a rising sun and rain cloud in that wonderful hood there at the top of that window. And then if we look still further, we can see at the Parsons table here, a very interesting use of special molded bricks for a beveled window. Very different from the window in the same building that does not have a bevel in the entrance into the window. And then here's the last house I want to show you because I think it's one of the most interesting houses in town. It's at 201 West Main. And if we look at the front elevation of this house and begin to look at various parts of it, first of all, we see that it has the stepped gable wall. But then if we look at the walls a little more closely, we see in addition to these stars on which are tied cables to support the front wall, they're most likely tied into the floor system inside the building. But we see these headers, and by the way, this is a Flemish Bond, alternating header, stretcher, no matter which direction you go, whether horizontal or vertical. We see these headers that have more mortar around them, and the mortar is brighter than the other surrounding headers and stretchers. And my theory is that this is where they placed scaffold framing as they were building this wall up. And once they got to the top of the wall, they took the scaffold down, pulled the supports out of these holes by then, and used pointing technique to insert headers. And since it was a different batch of mortar and probably a different craftsman, we can see where the headers were placed as they took the scaffold support down. By the way, they built the wall all the way around the house at one time. They didn't build one section of wall, such as the front, and then go to the sides. They built up all of the walls all around the house in one step and kept it going that way until they got to the very top. But how peculiar this is. Here's some bricks that look like they're ready for some more Flemish Bond. But the Flemish Bond is not there. What happened? And then if you look at the wall to the left, which is recessed behind the front wall that I was just showing you, you see that it's not the Flemish Bond anymore, it's the common American Bond. Well, my theory is that the building of the house got interrupted by the Civil War. And so after the war, they came back and added what had been intended all along, the west side of the house. But by that time, they have some freedom in the design. They're getting away from the Greek Revival period with its rigid, symmetrical front elevation all in one plane. And they're taking advantage of some more freedom and style. And when you look at the side of this, here's an interior door that becomes exposed to the exterior, but protected by the porch as this house undergoes construction. And then a very interesting thing that Jack and Tammy Moore discovered was not only that they have the rat's teeth there, the pointed special molded bricks, but among the dentils in the cornice, they had painted the entire recess among the dentils white. And so, of course, Jack and Tammy restored that feature of this building. This is another building that was built that was, at least after the Civil War, most likely, was painted red. And then they penciled mortar joints over it. Now, if you look carefully at the position of the mortar joints, they do not necessarily follow the pattern of the mortar. You've got 2 vertical mortar joints on that top course of bricks, one on each side of the mortar joint that actually follows the mortar. And then below the mortar joint that follows the mortar, you've got another false mortar joint. And then you go down to the 3rd course from the top, and you've got another couple of mortar joints that are false, that are painted over the bricks, one on each side of the true mortar itself. And I can't figure out what they were doing, because it doesn't look like they were imitating the Flemish Bond, because the position of the mortar joints don't come into the Flemish Bond. Maybe they were just not aware of any design at all, and they were making up their own design as they went. I have no idea, and it's something we'll probably never know. The side of this house is the common American Bond. So when you stand on the corner to the left, the side street, First Avenue, you see the common American Bond. Facing Main Street to the right, you see the Flemish Bond. And one other interesting thing about this house is a much later built chimney with some nice banding on it, and also a very nice arch covering the chimney. A very, very interesting house. Well, you've heard this saying, oh, if these walls could only talk, the stories they could tell. Well, I hope you agree with me that they do tell lots of stories. One time when I was behind Dr. Sam Thatcher in a Civic Trust covered dish dinner, he suddenly turned from placing food on his plate to me and said, just out of the clear blue sky, an old historic building is a dynamic living entity whose health is either improving or declining. And having said that one statement, he turned around again and continued to place food on his plate. But I thought that statement out of the clear blue sky was a real truism and really a significant statement. So beware, as these buildings watch history pass by, the historic buildings are also watching us, watching you.